Well, we have a question about influences, and they are wondering who are the important influences on each of you. And then they ask George, they say they have knowledge that you have listed both Lovecraft and Faulkner among your influences. And how do you square the tension between their purple and spare prose?
Wait.
Which one is purple
Yeah.
and which one is spare?
Wait, which one is spare? Faulkner and Lovecraft?
Yeah.
There's not much spareness there.
There's no spareness there.
There is no spare there.
No.
Faulkner's influence on me, while I read his books, I haven't read all of his work by any means, but I read some of it. But the greatest influence that Faulkner has had on me is his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which, if you haven't read it, you can find it online. And it's a very moving speech about the kind of writing he was doing and what he thinks fiction should be about. And in particular, he said the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. And I've taken that particular phrase as kind of a mantra for my work. And that's where I think all of this stuff about genre is unimportant, because if it is a important work, we are all writing about the human heart in conflict with itself, whether it's on a spaceship or inside a medieval castle in some fantasy land, or whether it's in suburban Chicago in a mainstream novel. Doesn't matter. We're telling stories about the human heart in conflict with itself, and I think Faulkner nailed it there. And that's the influence. Lovecraft, I think, was the greatest horror writer who ever lived. He's certainly one of the big three. He's right up there with Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe. There are many other good horror writers, but nobody approaches those three. And he just scared the bejesus out of me when I encountered his work at the age of 13 or so. And I still do occasionally when I reach for a scary effect in a book or a story. I reach for Lovecraftian effects. He's a writer I've sometimes tried to echo or write like. I don't think I can. I'm not, I don't have the deep level of insanity, I think, that drove some of his best work. But yes, he did have a huge influence on me, along with science fiction and fantasy writers. I mean, Tolkien, Robert E. Howard on the fantasy side, Fritz Leiber to a certain extent on the science fiction side, Robert E. Heinlein, Andre Norton, who was another writer that I read, when I was quite young. I think the biggest influences are the people you read when you're young. I mean, I'm 68 years old now. I read many books that are good and I admire them, but they're not going to influence me. I'm not going to find a new writer and, oh my God, this guy, I've got to try to do what he's doing here. No, the influences are all in your formative years when you're still vulnerable to influences.
Yeah.
Let's see, I think we've got two for George. I'm going to ask them both to you together. Who would you want to see on the Iron Throne, dead or alive? You can think about that one. Then, whose death do you regret the most?
Who would I like to see on the Iron Throne? Well, I'm not going to reveal that. You're going to have to keep reading the books and find out there. That's a little too much. You guys argue about that. Whose death do I regret the most? John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy.
Okay, I have one final question for both of you. So, what are you most excited about in the field of science and fiction and fantasy today? What excites you about where the field's going? Do you have particular writers you think everybody should be reading?
There's a lot of writers coming in. I mean, science fiction has conquered the world from this little ghetto genre that you weren't supposed to associate with. We've taken over the world. We've taken over television. We've taken over movies. Most of the highest-grossing movies of all time are science fiction, fantasy movies, comic book movies, and all that. And as a result of that, of course, more and more people are entering the field, and there are some extraordinary new talents that are coming up, and that's all very exciting to me. Admittedly, there's so much of it that I often feel like I can't keep up, just because there are so many new people entering. You know, there was a time, once upon a time, when certain science fiction fans, like Forrest J. Ackerman, were able to read every science fiction book published in a year. All the magazines, all the novels, he read them all. But even by the 70s, when I broke in, you couldn't do that any longer. But then there was another time, like 20 years, where, yeah, there was a lot of books being published, a lot of stories. You couldn't read them all, but some of them you knew were more important than others, and you could kind of keep up with the important parts of the field. You can't do that anymore either. The field has diversified so much in terms of genres and subject genres. I mean, we have epic fantasy and high fantasy and dark fantasy and urban fantasy, and you know, we go on with that. You know, science fiction. We have the cyberpunk movement, and you know, the new wave is pretty well gone, but it left its residues on the shore. We have the new space opera, the new weird, all of these things, and you can just read in one of these subgenres and still have more books and more writers and more stories to read than you ever had before. One of the things that is exciting to me is the fact that not only is the field becoming more diverse in terms of subject matters and subgenres, but it's becoming more diverse sexually and ethnically and nationally. We're seeing more and more, I mean, I don't want to say that they've never been there. There've always been women writing science fiction, and some great ones. Andre Norton, one of the formative writers of my own youth, was actually Alice Mary Norton. And you had Lee Brackett and C.L. Moore, two incredible writers of the golden age. And there was a huge influx of women in the 70s. But today it's many more. It's exponentially larger. And we're seeing more and more writers from other countries. Cixin Liu won the Hugo Award, the first translated novel. He's a Chinese writer in China. Three Body Problem won the Hugo Award. First time a translated novel has ever won. And in the same year, a Dutch writer for a translated novelette, I believe, also won. So we had two translations. Science fiction has conquered not only the United States, but the entire world. I mean, books are being published in all these countries, and they're largely American and to a lesser extent British books. But now, for the first time, we're getting a reciprocation on that. We're getting their visions as well as them getting our visions. So I think all that is tremendously exciting.
Well, I share these sentiments. We come from a time when science fiction was looked down on, and so I personally have a chip on my shoulder that will never go away. And I like to punch people who don't like science fiction. And yet now we are all living in a science fiction novel that we are co-writing together. It's called Reality, so the predictions came right. And because of the work of people like George, it's really central to the culture. People talk in terms of Game of Thrones because everybody's read it or seen it and can understand each other's references. And that is a very heartwarming experience. And then in terms of new writers, I think one of the things that happens is it's harder to look down the generations to new work than it is to look to the generation right before you, which is so incredibly vivid to the mind as a reader. But I will say that I see, when I test out the waters, because I'm always trying to not know what's going on so that I can do my own thing without fear of learning anything from anybody else. I would say that when I talk about younger writers, I see great work by Jonathan Lethem or Cory Doctorow or Paolo Bacigalupi, also Kelly Link or Nora Jemison or Nnedi Okofor, and almost all these people are probably nearly 50 years old. So my sense of
those are two generations back. There are new people than
there are, but I don't.
New people.
Those are in a mist to me, in that I have not explored the latest work being done. I'm confident it's out there and that it's great, and it's that's not really my job as a reader. I'm still reading Daniel Defoe with immense pleasure. So I'm a little off the cutting edge, but I love it all.
I'm really excited about all the amazing work that's come out of Clarion in the last few years. Alyssa Wong and Sam Miller, Carmen Machado, so many people just producing amazing work. So rush out and read work by all those people if you
Yes.
haven't heard of them.